Hello again, and thank you for joining us for today. Our topic is on export control and how to implement data access control that eases regulatory pressure, with a special case study from Bell Helicopter. So without further ado, let me introduce our expert speakers for today's session. First, we have Jerry Gebel from Axiomatics. He's the president for Axiomatics Americas, where he is responsible for sales, customer support, marketing, and business development for the Americas region. Prior to Axiomatics, he was VP and Service Director for Burton Group's identity management practice, where he also published reports on authorization, federation, access governance, user provisioning, and other IAM topics. Jerry has also been active in advancing the use of identity standards, having led interoperability projects for authorization, federation, and user-centric specifications. In addition, Jerry spent nearly 15 years in the financial services industry as a security architect. So welcome to Jerry. And then second, we'll be hearing a special case study from our customer, Greg Heartsfield at Bell Helicopter Textron. Greg is a security specialist at Bell Helicopter. He received his master's degree in software engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and has been working with systems that manage export control data for over 10 years as a software developer at Bell. He is currently responsible for the system that provides granular data access globally across Bell's PLM, ERP, and manufacturing systems. So great to have you both with us today. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jerry, to get us started.
All right, Kelly, thank you very much. Thanks for that intro. That's awesome. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks to Greg for being here as well. So here's our agenda for the session today. We're obviously going to be talking about export control and some of the challenges in addressing attribute-based access control for those kind of requirements. But I think some of Greg's experiences and lessons learned will be applicable to anyone in any other industry who's looking at deploying or looking to approach an ABAC deployment. We're also going to talk about ABAC and PLM systems, product lifecycle management systems, as are frequently deployed in high-tech manufacturing environments. I'll turn it over to Greg to talk about his case study, and then as Kelly mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A toward the end of the session. So if you think of questions along the way, please do put them in the GoToWebinar Q&A box. All right, so when we look at export control, it raises particular kinds of challenges for organizations because we find that governments around the world will impose rather strict limitations on certain kinds of technologies. Here in the U.S., this is coming from the State Department and the Commerce Department, for example. And typically they do apply to military kinds of technologies and capabilities, but they can also cover other areas as well. And so what happens here is that the regulations, what they'll do is they will categorize any kind of good or product that they deem to be sensitive, that needs to be controlled, and then companies operating in these industries are therefore obliged to categorize products according to this kind of nomenclature, and then further, of course, to ensure that the proper controls are in place so that this kind of information and data is not shared with any kind of restricted party. So that's, of course, there's a lot more complexity to it, but that's in a nutshell. And what we'll see is that you can face rather severe penalties for not living up to these export control regulations. Here's just one example of a rather hefty fine for release of encryption capabilities. Just an example that the penalties can be rather severe, and so there's definitely a strong business case behind having the proper controls in place for the export control topic. But export control, like other regulations, continue to change. It's not something that you do this once and your system doesn't have to be changed forever again. You know, the rules and classification schemes are continually revised, most recently here in 2013. And you want to make sure, of course, to stay up to date because you want to make sure you don't have any potential breaches or audit issues within your access control systems. And of course, this makes the environment that much more complex. It does take dedicated resources to keep up with these changes to regulations. And as I said before, it's not just here in the U.S., but if you're operating in different countries around the world with their own export restrictions, you definitely get quite a matrix effect of complexity here. But we think that ABAC, or an attribute-based access control model, is dynamic enough to accommodate and handle these different kinds of regulatory changes because we have the ability to take into account context that is important to export control, such as location, the nationality or citizenship of a user, the license validity, their organization, the jurisdiction, and of course people travel, right? So you may have to determine rules or access rules based on where they happen to be deployed at this moment in time. And it's also scalable to be able to adapt to a changing environment, that you can have these policies defined and managed centrally and then enforced at runtime, so you can pull in lots of different contextual information under this single set of access control policies. And underneath an ABAC system, of course, is a standards-based language, the XACML or XACML language. So you can alter the policies, re-implement them as needed, and also audit those policies to ensure that you remain in compliance with your export control regulations. And then as it relates to PLM systems, I mean, some of our core objectives here certainly is to protect the intellectual property of the organization, first and foremost, even beyond the export control regulations. Organizations want to protect their own IP, trade secrets, specifications, designs, formulas, and so on. These are all the kinds of assets or resources that we're interested in protecting. But as I often say, the most valuable, the most sensitive, the most important information that you have is precisely what you need to share, in this case likely with supply chain members and other partners, in order to build systems, build capabilities, and so on. So you have to find a way to securely share this kind of data. You can't just lock it down and use it only for internal purposes. And then we combine this, of course, with the complexity of export control, because we have to avoid being fined, being out of compliance with these regulations. And the rules that need to be implemented are rather complex, and I think Greg will give us a sense of that during his section. And when you look at different departments, even within a company, across different applications, you often find that you don't have a consistent or common language to utilize here, and that there's often a challenge in finding the right stakeholders to be in control of the ABAC policies. And of course, around the world today, the political climate, excuse me, is constantly changing, which potentially impacts, the regulatory changes as well downstream. So, how do we do this with ABAC? And maybe just a really quick primer on some of the characteristics of an attribute-based access control system. Well, it's where you can, and in one case, centrally define and manage those authorization policies and rules. And they can be centrally defined but utilized by many different applications. And these policies use attributes, of course, right? That's why we call it attribute-based access control. And it defines not only who should have access, but from what kind of devices, based on their location, how they're related to the resource, time of day, and so on. So it's much more advanced than some of the more coarse-grained models like role or group-based access that we see prominently used today. And it's important to note that the ABAC system is externalized from the application. That is, we don't have the need for logic being built into the applications to determine who has access, but it calls this external service where those rules are defined, managed, and enforced at runtime. And of course, there is the standard behind the ABAC system. XACML, or the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, is an example of an ABAC system. In this case, we have the capabilities the standardized XACML provides, as well as interoperability and vendor independence. And when we often talk about ABAC with customers, they are not always familiar with it and always have a reference point of an RBAC model or a role-based access control approach. And so we're often getting into discussions, well, how do you compare and contrast them? How do you migrate from an RBAC model to an ABAC model? And just very briefly here on this topic, a role-based approach is very user-centric, and generally you have permissions or entitlements associated with roles that get assigned to a user. And users may have multiple roles, and it's often used for provisioning of user accounts and the like, but it also can be used at runtime for access control. And it's generally very coarse-grained. It's difficult to be very specific and contextual with a role-based system. That's where ABAC, or an attribute-based system, really shines, because you can have many attributes that are not only associated with the user, their cost center, their department, their location, their nationality, and so on, but also attributes associated with the action that you're attempting on the resource itself, who is its owner, how is it classified and categorized, and so on, but also environmental attributes, and this is where things like time of day and geolocation come into play. So in an ABAC system, all of that can be incorporated into the policies for permitting or denying access, but also at the runtime for enforcement and evaluation purposes. And on this slide here, we have a fairly high-level graphic of the architecture of an ABAC system. And so typically the way it operates is you have some user attempting to access a resource or application, and in the middle here you have some kind of intercepting code. In the XACML parlance, it's called a policy enforcement point that stops the flow and then will generate an access request to the authorization service, or the policy decision point. And this is the external service that knows about access policies and rules, but also can look up additional attributes about the user or about the resource, and then finally make its decision. It's simply a permit or deny. If it's permit, then the access, of course, is allowed to proceed. If it's denied, then the flow is stopped, and an error message will be sent back to that user. So that's a very basic flow for how an ABAC system works, how the Axiomatics policy server works. And we apply a similar kind of architecture to database content as well, where the outcome is, instead of permit or deny, it's actually dynamically changing the SQL, but that's for a different kind of use case. So with that, I think I'm finished with my introduction. Greg, I'll hand it over to you and advance the slides for you. But welcome, Greg, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Hello, everyone on the call. So I'm Greg Heartsfield from Bell Helicopter. We made the move to ABAC about 6 years ago with the help of Axiomatics, and they've asked us to share some of what we've learned through our implementation and how it's benefited our business. You can go to the next slide, Jerry. So you can see some background about Bell Helicopter here, along with one of our products in action. At Bell, we design, manufacture, and support both commercial and military vertical lift aircraft with customers in over 135 countries. All of our helicopters do very important jobs, but many of them are used to save lives every day, so We take our responsibilities to deliver and support these products very seriously, and the systems that we'll be talking about today are critical to that mission. Next slide. So the story starts for us just over 6 years ago as we were modernizing our engineering and manufacturing systems. We were taking the traditional approach of using role-based access controls along with custom code, but this was quickly becoming much too complex for us to support. So as we started to realize we would be maintaining tens of thousands of lines of code multiplied across many applications in different programming languages, we decided to go back to the drawing board and rethink our approach to this problem. And what we realized was that we needed to write our access control policies once and only once, and then use a dynamic service that could answer complex authorization questions in a consistent way for all of our different systems. And when we looked into how to make this happen, we found that the XACML architecture supported this perfectly and allowed us to remove a significant amount of complexity from our applications and then to accelerate our modernization effort. Next slide. So I wanted to just touch on the kinds of requirements that we had for authorizing access to data and why role-based access controls simply weren't sufficient. We needed to take into account several attributes about the person making the request, things like their nationality and what company they work for. And these attributes need to be combined with attributes about the items that the person is trying to view. So things like the export classification, intellectual property ownership data, and the export licenses that we may have in effect at the moment in order to make a decision about the access this person should have. Some of those attributes are even more dynamic. Like Jerry mentioned, the location of where the request is being made or the time of the request. So we found roles to be very inflexible when trying to design a system like this, and they just couldn't account for the most dynamic requirements that we had. After some in-house prototyping with XACML that proved the concept of what we were trying to do, we decided to partner, or we needed a partner for the core technology and to help us have a complete solution. And we evaluated several companies' products, and we found that Axiomatics had the right combination of adherence to the XACML architecture and the standards, along with powerful tools to help us both administer and manage policies, and then most importantly, a high performance and reliable decision engine that we could use in our environment, and that product was the Axiomatics policy server. Next slide. One of the things that I think was most critical to our effort succeeding and growing for the past 6 years has not necessarily been about the technology as much as how we've involved our partners in the business. So very early on in this effort, we identified the key areas of the business that had some stake in access controls, and we worked with them to create our very first set of policies. And those were all traceable back to real business requirements. They weren't just pulled out of legacy code. They were taken from legal documents that we had interpreted from the business. And those areas of business, those key stakeholders for us were our global trade compliance group, our legal organization, contracts department, and also our engineering department and others. And we didn't stop this effort right after we had our first set of policies. We formalized this group of people into what we called our policy working group, and we kept them engaged on a regular basis to help craft and approve all of our policy changes going forward and to this day. In order to keep those meetings with our key decision makers as productive as possible, because they're not easy to get a hold of, we had all our policy change requests use a very simple template that documented exactly what was being requested. This usually involves citing the business or regulatory source documents that triggered the need for a policy change, the scope of the people or the organizations that are involved, the data affected, and then finally a list of the rules themselves that is just kind of written out in plain English. And this process that we developed had a really huge benefit for all parties involved. On the IT side, we then had a defined process for how we make changes to policies that would have a huge impact across all of our systems. Requesters, they get a streamlined process for having their change reviewed by all the right people in a very timely fashion. They don't have to hunt people down themselves. And the approvers on the policy working group are able to make decisions on properly documented proposals, and they don't have to worry about misinterpretations or other approvals being skipped. So, for example, our global trade compliance group can just talk about the export implications of a proposal, and they know that legal is in the same room, and they can address the contractual or the IP issues that might come up. So by putting everyone in the same room, it made it much faster to get good decisions on policies, and that's been vital to making ABAC work for us. Next slide. Okay. Another critical factor in making our system simple and manageable was dealing with the differences in terminology across different systems. So we wanted our policies to be as readable to the business as possible, and be as close to the legal documents that they came from. And again, the XACML architecture was very helpful here, since we could use policy information points to retrieve and transform data from different sources into something that was useful for policies at a high level that the business could understand. We had a lot of challenges early on as we started connecting systems that may not have ever had to agree on anything before, but having that common higher-level vocabulary for talking about data really helped focus application teams on finding solutions to support the legal and business requirements. And also from the start, we made every effort to make our policies application neutral, so that all of our systems get the benefit of up-to-date and consistent enforcement. And that's very critical when we have users that interact with many of these systems, and they all expect them to work the same way. They don't want to see one system that gives them more or less access than another. Next slide. So we didn't just flip a switch one day and put Axiomatics in the critical path of all of our most important business applications. We took a very gradual approach, and we were able to show early on in this effort that we could handle the huge volumes of requests from our PLM system. After that, we demonstrated that the system was reliable enough to be part of our 24/7 manufacturing environment. And then finally, with our ERP system, performance and reliability weren't questions that were coming at us. People were asking instead, how quickly can you give us the same controls that these other applications have? And that was so that they could have our employees across the world take full advantage of functionality in the ERP system. And there's really no way that we could have gotten to the point where the question was just how fast can you give this to us, as opposed to performance and reliability, if we didn't have the core Axiomatic software being just totally reliable and efficient and correct in its decisions all the time. Another benefit that we've seen is that we've dramatically reduced the time and effort that's been required to grant users access to data that they're authorized to see. Our product development lifecycle has gotten much shorter just in the time that I've worked at Bell, and at the same time, our external collaboration has increased greatly. So it's just not acceptable anymore to take weeks or months to figure out how do we allow a major design partner or a supplier to safely come into our systems. So by having this just be a policy change instead of a code change and an application rebuild and an application retest cycle, we've been able to really shorten the product development lifecycle. And now application teams can concentrate on their longer-term business functionality and not get sidetracked with just changes in access to data or things like export control reform. Next slide. Application teams also don't want to deal with storing and protecting sensitive data like user citizenship, especially if that's not part of their core functionality. So by using external attribute sources, we really greatly simplified many of our applications and reduced risk of exposing PII. We're helping application teams stay focused on what they do best, which is usually not interpreting ITAR and EAR regulations or contracts. It's implementing and improving their core business functionality. And because of the stability and flexibility of the Axiomatic software in the XACML architecture, we've been able to basically just get out of their way and be one less thing that they have to worry about. as we did this implementation in our environment, what we saw early on was some skepticism from the application teams. And if anything went wrong in a system that we had ABAC control on, we were very used to getting the very first phone call and having to prove ourselves innocent. But as I said, because of the performance and stability of the core system that we've shown over time, we've really seen that perspective change, and we've built up very good relationships with our application teams, and there's a lot more trust there now. So I think the key takeaway for me for all of this is that we've seen benefits in controlling the data itself, which we were obligated to do, but there have been lots of side benefits from all the things that we've freed up application teams to not have to worry about. So both on the technical side, the things that they can leave to the Axiomatics system to handle, and on the policy side, the questions they no longer have to be asking and be directly involved with. So it's taken a lot of hard work to get here, but I think my colleagues at Bell here would agree both that this has been a very worthwhile and beneficial effort, and that Axiomatics was critical to this being a long-term success. And with that, I will hand it back over to Jerry.
All right, Greg, thank you very much for that. I just have a couple closing comments here, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So I encourage attendees to put in their questions if they had some follow-ups for you, Greg. I think there's tremendous information that you've shared here, a lot of lessons learned, and it's always those side benefits that are sometimes hard to quantify, but you definitely feel them over time, so it's great to hear that. Now, we talked a little bit earlier before Greg's section about this ability to shift to an attribute-based access control model, and certainly that's what we're aiming to do here at Axiomatics. And by being able to incorporate all different kinds of attributes into these access policies, we think that ABAC is best suited to address very sophisticated requirements such as export control. Certainly we see other kinds of industries with equally sophisticated and complex requirements. And an ABAC system can be used to protect data and resources within a database itself, within an application such as APIs and business tier logic, or even at the file server. So you get that consistent enforcement across all of these different kinds of platforms and applications. And then we provide the tooling for policy editing, lifecycle management, and overall operational management of the ABAC system. And part of the end goal here is to reduce or eliminate those audit findings, but also, as Greg was saying, to help the business operate more efficiently. So we do have some time for Q&A, so we certainly invite the audience to submit some of their questions. We did have some additional resources here. Typically we point to axiomatics.com resources, but here are some external docs such as from Oasis. And one of the questions I had for you, Greg, I know that your project started quite a bit before this export control profile was created at Oasis, but for new organizations looking to shift to ABAC, do you think this particular profile would be helpful for them?
Yeah, I definitely think it would be. It's a good baseline to look at, and it has a lot of good. So the things that we're talking about, like a common vocabulary, that's a good example of a common vocabulary that you can have different application teams look at and understand how they can map to that. Instead of having everybody have their own attributes that are only applicable for their small domain, you can look at things like IP ownership across all your applications. And again, it's a good model for some of the export attributes, the export control attributes that are useful for U.S. export law.
Good. And speaking of taxonomies, here's a question. Did you find that you had to standardize on the subject taxonomies for classification or mapping to a standard vocabulary?
Absolutely. So we had many different identity systems, and they all had, again, a slightly different take on some of these attributes. So we did, that was one of the first things we did, is we standardized on what those identity attributes were, and then we made efforts to get the best quality data from wherever the master of that was into our information points to feed Xacamel. And again, as time progressed and we improved those sources, we didn't need to rewrite the vocabulary. The vocabulary stayed the same. We just got higher quality data.
Well, how did you get higher quality data? Because that's also a question that often comes up in these kind of discussions, particularly if those sources are not today used for access control decisions. How do you get the owners of that data, to clean it up and then also to maintain it? How was that in your experience at Bell?
So there's no better motivator for clean data than when it's actually used for day-to-day access control and real business purposes. So whereas maybe we collected nationality in the past, but it wasn't used real time for users' access, once we switched to a model where nationality needs to be known and it needs to be correct, we developed the processes to both identify where that data was lacking and improve those processes, because we saw that as soon as we improved that area, people got access faster. So we just made sure that when we went live in these different areas, we had good enough data, so it wasn't giving us incorrect answers. It may have just been incomplete, and made the areas of the business that were responsible for those pieces of data aware that this was the impact, right? Because you were missing this kind of data, these are the people that can't get access, and so we need to kind of do deep dives in those different areas, figure out how to optimize our other process, maybe our HR process, or maybe our other.
Are you still there, Greg? I seem to have lost your connection. Kelly, can you come back on the line? Is it just my line that's going haywire here?
I think we lost Greg. Can you hear? Yeah.
We'll give him a moment to come back online. Someone may have discovered his hideout at the office there and pulled the plug on him. So I've got a few more questions to ask Greg, but if you still have others that come to mind, please do chime in the Q&A box on GoToWebinar. Otherwise, Kelly, I'm going to have to ask you these questions.
Sorry, guys. I think I just lost my phone.
Okay, you're back.
Very good.
Yeah.
Just in the nick of time.
Yeah, I was about to ask Kelly these follow-up questions, so it's a good thing you're back online. All right, great. So I think you did finish your thought on that, but there was a follow-up here that's a very good question, and that is when you're accessing these external data sources for attributes during runtime, certainly a question that comes up is, okay, what about performance? Is that going to introduce too much latency? So can you explain more or describe some of your lessons learned around the performance of these systems that are providing attributes to the Xacamel authorization service?
Sure. So yeah, and it's not just performance, right? If one of those sources is very fast, but it has to take downtime every week and not available for 2 hours, that can affect the availability of the ABAC service to other areas of the business. So yeah, we're very concerned with both the performance and the availability of that data. So for some sources, you just have to, when you're selecting where to pick those from, you just keep those things in mind as you're designing those information points. Then you can also take advantage for just the performance side of caching. And I know that Axiomatics Policy Server has a lot of that technology built in, but caching for us, especially on the user identity side, is a huge win because you don't normally need to refresh that data from the master system with every request. So caching is the usual answer to that, and then there's other more exotic approaches like keeping local copies of those data sources close by so that you can use them as well. But we don't want to over-optimize this either. I mean, there are, we look at the application itself and what its normal response time is without ABAC, and if the additional resource lookup time is not significant in the context of that, we don't really feel like we need to optimize it any further. And that's been the case in most of these systems, where we're much faster than the application itself, and if we add an extra, say, 5% overhead, no one really notices. We also take advantage of the fact that in some of our systems, this data is actually resident in it as well. So a lot of classification data may be present in these systems already to support other business functionality. Maybe it's data marking. And so we get that information from the system itself, and that makes it dramatically faster because it reduces the number of external lookups we have to do.
Okay, good advice. I mean, obviously that circumstance can be different for other industries, right, other scenarios, but in your case that you've been able to handle that adequately, so that sounds good. Can we talk a little bit more about your policy governance team, your policy working group? And you described who was on that, legal, contracts, engineering. I don't think you mentioned info security.
So, yeah, I think I left it off just because I'm in the info security group.
Okay.
So, yeah, we, in IT security, we are a member of that as well. And it's not, that's kind of the core membership. There's other parties that we call in as their expertise may be needed. So we may have a representative from the PLM system team come in to talk about some aspect of something that they're changing that might affect a policy or some new requirement that they have.
Okay, fair enough. And I don't think you mentioned, but how often do you meet? How often do you actually change policies that require this group to meet?
So we have a standing meeting every 2 weeks, and that's mostly just to make sure that we have time blocked off on important people's calendars, because it's not easy to get these people from very different departments to meet up ad hoc. But we also have ad hoc meetings when there's something that may be more urgent. And those typically would be conducted offline, where we would actually discuss with each member kind of separately. And if there aren't any major concerns, then we can go forward with that. But we like to have these discussions with everyone present so that it's just quicker.
Well, and it sounds
less hopping around.
Right. Well, it sounds like you've made that very efficient, very time efficient for people too, so that if there are no changes to review, fine, you guys are dismissed and you can carry on. But otherwise, it sounds like a really good process you've got set up there.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded too good to be true when we first came up with it. That instead of having to go to email and call and track down all these different people, we'll actually be able to get them all to sit down in a room. But I think they were very happy with the kind of controls that we were giving them, which is something they've been asking from IT for a long time. They want to be able to have real-time control based on these attributes, and they want to have policies that they can look at and understand and influence. So when we gave them that sort of ability to interact with IT systems in a productive way, they felt it was worth their time to participate.
Excellent. What about the developers? This is a constituency that often has to be won over or convinced, that an ABAC approach is a better way for them. Can you talk more about how developers at your company have, how their lives have changed? I think you mentioned this a little bit, but can you explain a little bit more about what it was like for them to adopt an ABAC approach?
Sure. So I'd say there's kind of two categories. There's the lone application developer who's got an application they need to develop. It's small, but it may grant access to a large amount of data, and they need to solve this export control problem, and they don't have very much time to do it. And for them, this is great because they can interact with a very simple service and put this level of control that they feel very confident in, and the rest of the business does as well. And then they can basically leave it alone. They don't have to be involved in making changes every other week as maybe a new organization rolls on or as these rules change. So for them, it's great, and they've embraced it. For the larger applications, you're right. They have a lot of, they're only in their position because they know how to make big applications stay up, and they don't do that by just adding random stuff into it. They want to keep very tight control on their dependencies. And for them, it's been more a process of showing in other smaller systems that this has been a reliable and performant component. So, every new system we win over, we can point back to the last one and say, they've been using this and they have higher reliability requirements than you do, and they've had no outages over the past 2 years. And the upside is that they've also had to make no changes due to export control reform, due to other suppliers coming in, other design partners, and so they've been able to eliminate that workload on them, and maybe spend that effort instead on other performance optimizations, on other reliability improvements that were more important to them. So that's why I said it was about getting more trust in the teams. You have to demonstrate in, I guess, smaller case studies and smaller environments and applications that this is not a risky thing. This frees you up to do more important things. And once they saw that, then that tide is kind of turned, and it's accepted that this is the right way to do things. It reduces their risk and it helps them be more productive. So now we've been more in a mode in the last maybe year or two of people, even with big applications, asking us to help them as opposed to us trying to find a way to get into their business.
Right. Well, that sounds like a very similar story when we've talked in the past about other kinds of identity management projects. Start small, prove the case, build up that trust, and before you venture into other territory, other applications. Right. It sounds like a tried and true approach is to make sure your foundation is rock solid before you try to do too much too soon.
Right, and it also helped us develop those attributes, because if we could control a large user population on not a business critical but an important application that deals with all this data, you can then look at that more important system and say, I already deal with all your users and I already deal with all your data, so we've done the cleanup work, and now we're ready to move to where we're controlling something that's business critical.
Right, right. I've got one more question for you, but I'll put out a last call from the audience for any other questions. Mine is about ABAC here, and at what point or how was the decision made that you needed to move from ABAC to an attribute-based model? What what of your stakeholders who had the input that said we really need to make this transition?
So it really was something that came from the technical team that was building some of those early systems. We looked at the roles we were making, and we saw that they weren't very clean. They were having to combine many different aspects of a person's attributes into one role, and we went from having maybe, let's say, for example, 20 core roles that represented business functionality into hundreds of roles that were complicated by organization information, location information, and nationality, and it just wasn't tenable to say, and now we got to go build that same kind of system for these other things that we're replacing. So we on the technical side, we just had to stop and say, there's got to be a better way of doing this, and we just kind of went off on the side and had some discussions, and once we had something that we could present as a proof of concept to our management, we did that, and they gave us the go ahead to go forward and keep investigating that, and that's what led to some of our early production systems using this technology.
Good, good. But to clarify, you still use those core role definitions within your ABAC policies, right?
Right, right. So we made the decision that we only wanted to, at least in our environment, use the ABAC technology and philosophy for those things that crossed application boundaries. So if there was a business-oriented role that only made sense in one application, we were just going to leave that alone. But if there was a rule that was applicable across all of our systems, that made sense to externalize, to write policies for. And that was a good dividing line for the application teams. They understood that the things that are built into their application or that are very tightly bound up in all the workings of their system, we're not touching that. We're touching the things that they don't really want to put in their system but are being forced to. And so we were solving a problem that they didn't have a good answer for, and at the same time we were simplifying their role structure and their code base.
Very good. Excellent. Well, I think we'll close the session there with those comments, Greg. Thank you so much for sharing some of your experiences here. I think it's extremely valuable for you to do that. We very much appreciate you as a partner in your ABAC deployment here, and very much appreciate you being able to share some of your experiences with the audience today. So thanks again, Greg. Thanks, Kelly, for organizing and hosting today.